we're back and we're going to carry on in our conversation about the modern masculinity crisis, trying to find answers about how we ought to live as men, looking at ancient principles to guide us. Now, it's obvious to anyone who is trying to live in the modern Western world as a man that it's very confusing what is expected of you, that we don't know what we're supposed to do. It's not clear if we should be looking to traditional societal roles that once upon a time, even 50 years ago, were entirely the norm for us. Are we going to try and recapture that? Can we recapture that? And if you followed the answer that I gave to Knight Arnold in the Q&A, you'd see what we're actually looking for here is not to recapture traditional masculinity, but to look at the principles that underlie what is right about a man, what is right for a man to do. The obviousness of this crisis is plain when you look into the response that Jordan Peterson got when he started offering young men some simple advice about how to live their lives. Now, he was looking to Scripture to look at the principles that govern the Bible, I should say, as Scripture, to look for principles that ought to govern us in the way that we live. I, too, am looking into the book of Judges, and we're going to carry on that conversation looking at the first judge to try and see what principles are there for us in this book that has everything to do with how a man ought to live in relationship to his world, to his family, and ultimately to his God. Now, none of this really makes any sense unless we take the first principle that we already established, which is that a man, in order to be what he ought to be, needs to have a king. He can't live for himself. He needs to live for some higher ideal, some higher authority. So the king of the judges was God. And this is an interesting thing because the establishment of Israel was that there would be no king. Now, God talked about how in the future there would be a king when they rejected him as their king, but these judges served God as their king. So we walked through the whole story arc, the last video that I did. We're going to focus in on the first guy, which is this guy named Othniel. Now, Othniel's a really interesting picture that is presented to us because we don't really get to know a whole lot about this guy. Basically, we get this story that is presented to us in which Othniel is basically responding to a challenge which one of the leaders of Israel gives, that there is this fortified city on a hill, and whoever will take this city, I will give my daughter Asa's hand in marriage. So this Othniel guy, before he was a judge, says, I'm going to do that. I will respond to the challenge, and I will serve, and I will go and risk myself to take this city. And then it just simply says, and he went up against it, and he was victorious. And then there's this seemingly out of place little narrative where it says that when Asa came to him, she asked him to please ask for land from her father Caleb. And then he complies and says, certainly we'll do this. And then she goes and dismounts from her donkey, and Caleb says to her, what is it that you want? She says, please give me the springs to go with the land. And Caleb gives her the upper springs and the lower springs to the land in the Negev that he'd given to her. Now, we'll explore that in a minute. But what's significant is that the narrative took the time to give us that account when it didn't care to give us any story of the battle for the city. It didn't care to give us any explanation of his martial brilliance or any of his great exploits as a hero. All it wanted to tell us was that here's this dude Othniel. He rose to the challenge, defeated his enemies, and won a wife for himself. And when he won that wife, he listened to her advice and respected her enough to send her to represent his family, to represent the two of them together to her father. And then you see that the Israelites fall away and they reject God as their king, and then bad stuff happens, and there is this guy, this king in Mesopotamia, who comes and he oppresses them. And when the king Cushan Rishathaim of Mesopotamia comes and lords over them and oppresses them, the people cry out and they repent, and God raises up this Othniel as a judge. And all it says is that he defeated the king and drove him out of Israel, and then he reigned for 40 years as a judge, and there was peace in those days. So, what's really important for us in this narrative is what is there and what isn't there. If you were going to compare the narrative of Judges to, for example, Homer's epics, the Iliad or the Odyssey, or if you're to look at really any ancient heroic narrative coming out of Greece like Heracles, or even the Epic of Gilgamesh, in which the hero's exploits are given in great detail in his seeking after the eternal life and all of the great things that he accomplished and the places that he went. This story is so different. Like if you read the Iliad, you get lengthy descriptions of like Ajax with his 100-pound bronze shield standing on the beach, and it's stirring in your heart when you read it, like there is a man. He's standing there with this enormous shield, and everyone's throwing their javelins at him, but they can't pierce his shield, and he stands there and he holds the ground for the Greeks against the Trojans. That this mighty hero was such a great giant of men, and all of his exploits are given in poetic and great detail. The Odysseus and all of his journeys and all of his cunning and how he defeats the monsters and the ogres that he confronts, and all of the things that he went through are detailed in great vivid detail and poetic brilliance to let us look at this man and worship him. But that's not the picture we're getting here at all. You have Othniel, and the only thing that we are to see, that the narrator wants us to perceive, is that he was willing to go, and that when he had achieved great things and had won his wife, we're not given any detail or any exaltation of those great things, but that when he did, that he treated her with respect and as a partner that is able to accomplish things for the two of them. Now that makes a lot more sense when you put it in the context of the end and you read the whole narrative as a piece, and you see that at the end, the bookend on the other side of this narrative, we have the opposite picture of a husband and his concubine, who he didn't even deem to call his wife, and how he lets her get raped to death to save his own life, and basically treats her with no respect and cares nothing for her wishes. So, and if you look at that, he doesn't even listen to what's wrong. When she runs away from him, he doesn't even try to understand what's wrong, that guy at the end. So here we are with Othniel, and he's the picture of what a man should be. He's kind of the perfect judge, right? The judges that follow him are going to get progressively less perfect, but the narrative doesn't want to dwell on his perfection. It just wants to dwell on these two principles. So we have the principle that a man needs a king. The next principle, which we see in Othniel, and we'll see it again, is that he must be willing to serve at personal risk. The willingness to serve is what matters, not the fitness to serve. And you're going to see that get developed a lot as we go through this book too. So the fact of the absence of any sort of praise for Othniel's martial prowess or accomplishments is actually pointing out to us that the only thing that matters to the author of this book is that he was willing to serve. It doesn't matter that he was able and that he was great, because, well, there were a lot of people with capabilities, right? You're going to see that as you go through, that people in Israel, as they go further and further from their the root of masculinity, they become less and less willing to take personal risk, and they start basically looking outside of themselves in order to get the leadership that they need. And they're going to eventually stop even risking themselves at all and let a man stand alone. Well, here's Othniel leading everybody, but all that it wants us to see about him is that he's willing to serve. He's willing to take the risk. So if you want to take your next principle for masculinity here, it's going to be that you are willing to serve at personal risk. If and you'll see this come out, that if a man is not fit to serve, that he'll find a way to have the ability to do what it is that needs to be done. He'll find a way that is within his abilities and within his limitations, if he is willing. But if he's not willing, it doesn't matter how good he is at all. And I'll give you an example of this from my own personal kind of military experience here, okay? So remember, I served as an officer in the infantry corps. I've been in combat. I've done all that stuff. I've led and trained a lot of men. And something that I have observed over the years, which is really fundamentally important for you to understand here, is that a man's worthiness is not his capability. It is his willingness to serve. I have known a lot of very strong, very capable men who wouldn't sacrifice anything in service. And it didn't matter how much time they spent at the gym and on the track making their bodies perfect. When it came down to it, in the middle of a fight, their narcissism basically made themselves the most important thing on the battlefield. And so they took no risks, and therefore they were of no value, or of very limited value. I mean, they became essentially, assassins, in that they would only really put themselves out to engage the enemy when there was no great risk to themselves. And then you see these guys who are far less physically capable and far less capable of leadership in terms of their natural character, that charge forward with no respect of personal risk, and they're willing to go and bring the fight to the enemy. Those guys, regardless of how inferior they are in capability, are of enormous worth, and they become leaders by their example, right? So understand that. I'm not saying that being fit isn't good. It's really important, actually. But I'm saying that making yourself fit isn't the same thing as making yourself a worthy servant, an admirable man, right? That making yourself fit is only putting tools in the toolbox. You need to actually then prove your willingness to use them. Making yourself capable of speaking well doesn't make you a leader. Making yourself capable of managing well doesn't make you a leader. Those tools are very useful if you lead, but you have to choose to serve for you to be a good leader or to be a good man. Now, of course, we go back to that. What is the principle that we started with, which is that a man needs a king? If you have nothing to serve, you can't serve. So until you have chosen to serve a king, you will basically be useless as a man. You must have a king to serve, and then you must choose to be willing to serve that king. And I'm going to say this, it's very important that you understand this. If you choose to serve in advance, if you choose that you will sacrifice in advance, if you prepare yourself mentally, physically, and spiritually to offer yourself as a sacrifice in service, then when the time comes that you face a hard decision, your natural instinct, because of your your regular dedication of yourself to that service is going to be to plow through the fear and do the thing that you have chosen in your mind and fixed upon your heart to do. You need to choose now to be willing to serve then, whatever it costs. Because if you are going to weigh each situation and decide if that's something that you're willing to take on, then every single conflict is going to be a battle within yourself where your fight, flight, freeze instinct is going to be trying to control you and prevent you from engaging in anything that will cause risk to you. And you will not be effective even if you overcome it and choose to confront the problem. You need to choose in advance what you're going to do. I've told this story before, and I'm not sure, I don't think I have on these videos, but I'm going to walk you through an experience that I had when I was in Afghanistan, in Kandahar province. The first time that I ever ended up under enemy fire directly and not through like rockets and things like that. It was about 2 months into the tour. It was a quiet 2 months when we started because it wasn't the fighting season. But we were out and we were rebuilding this schoolhouse out in Kolk. And I was running convoys of supplies back and forth in my armored vehicle with my crew. And when I came back to the schoolhouse, and the company was all there, our infantry company, and that I belong to, but a firefight had just broken out to the west of our location. So I just waved the convoy off and drove straight into that conflict. I actually stopped on the way because there were a bunch of engineers hiding in the ditch, and I got them in the back of my carrier, and then we pushed forward to link up with, figure out what was going on, really. We got out there, saw that there were a bunch of local police forces that were under heavy fire. I mean, it was an intense firefight. There were RPGs coming in. They had airburst mortars dropping around the position. They didn't know how to use them, luckily, so they were largely ineffective. And they had some machine guns pumping away, and the ground was dancing with incoming fire. So we pulled up, I reported it, and then I moved forward to try and engage and support. What's interesting is what I'm going to tell you about that is that because I had trained myself for years to fight, and I had got all the drills down, and I'd gone through all the war games, and I'd prepared myself mentally for that confrontation, there was no conflict in me. Like, and my crew, I would argue, was the same. We pushed forward into contact. When we got into contact, I realized that they were firing from basically a village. They had one building, which was a gray pot, which we engaged and drove them out of with explosive rounds. And unlikely that we actually hurt anyone, but we smashed them and pushed them back. And then, because I'd also trained on the rules of war and had my ethics in place, I looked at the village, couldn't discern the exact point of fire, and did not panic and start firing blindly into a populated area, as I have seen done. But rather, we stopped, assessed the situation, well under fire, and my instinct, cool and calm through the whole thing, and that's not praising myself, that's a praise to those who trained me well to do these things. I just, like, without even thinking about it, stood up in the turret and waved my hands around until the guy with the machine gun on the other side shot at me. Because we learned to do this thing called a crack thump, where you hear the crack, the supersonic crack of the bullets, right? And it actually has like a, it's hard to explain, but it has like a line of sound. It's like a and goes neat, zip, zip, zip as it's passing your head too, I can tell you. But then you hear the thump, thump, thump of the originating muzzle fire. So I jumped up, waved my hands. He shot at me. I heard the crack, the thump, and then I got my eyes onto the area it was coming from. And then he fired again, and I saw the muzzle flash. And then I jumped down, swung the turret on, and engaged in through the doorway that he was firing from in a position of concealment and ended the firefight. Put him out, killed 6 guys and rescued all the police officers. That was a pretty risky thing to do, but I had trained in advance to do it, and I didn't have to think about it. It was an instinct. I had already dedicated myself to service. I had given myself to training, and I had equipped myself so that when the time came that there was confrontation, I knew without having to think. I just acted upon the things that I had trained myself to do. This is what it means to be willing to serve. It is you choose to set yourself apart so that when conflict comes, that you take the risk of doing what you know to be right. So you need to embed that principle into yourself as a man. You need to say, I am going to choose to sacrifice. I am going to choose to take risks for what I believe in, and I'm going to set myself apart for that. And then, when you end up in a confrontation, whether it's verbal, whether it's physical, whether it's moral and ethical, you will already have decided that you're going to take the hit to do what you want, what you think is right, to serve your king. Better make sure it's a worthy king that you're serving. Do that, embed that in yourself and your character, and you will do well in what you put yourself to. Now, the second principle here, the first one is be willing and set yourself apart for service to your king at whatever cost. Be willing and set yourself apart for service to your king at whatever cost. Okay? So you need a king, then you need to set yourself apart to serve him at whatever cost. Those are the first two. The third one, this is fundamental here to what it means to be a man, is respect your wife. Right? Othniel was a man, and the chief principle that is being presented to us in his story here is that he respected his wife. Don't care about how many javelins he took off the shield. Don't care about how many giants he slew or how many men he decapitated with a single blow. Don't care, whether he strolled into the Colosseum like a boss and said, "Are you entertained?" We care about the fact that he loved and respected his wife. Right? What does that mean? And here we get to, I think, one of the most fundamental problems with people looking to traditional masculinity is that traditional masculinity has rarely expressed this well. Now, I'm sure many individuals have within whatever time frame and tradition that you might find. However, the traditions themselves rarely bring this out as it ought to be brought out in the principle that is given to us in the Bible. Okay? So the Bible takes a lot of flack because it doesn't recognize equality in the way that the world wants it to be understood. It's all about equality of worth. It says many times and in many places that men and women are equal in the eyes of God. However, there are role distinctions that are being given here. The man is supposed to lead. And if you look at a passage like in Ephesians, you're going to find that it says that wives should submit to their husbands. Yeah, gets people real upset. But then it says that husbands must love their wives as Christ loved the church, sacrificing himself for her to raise her up holy and blameless before the Lord. And if you take that, right, it says that a man is the head of a wife as Jesus is the head of the man. A man is not a tyrant in the biblical model of relationship. A man is a caregiver, a guardian, a protector, and a respecter of his wife. He has to live with her as one who wants to protect her and guard her and guide her and sacrifice everything for what is good for her. That he should never take for himself from her that which hurts her. That he should never exercise his physical mastery over her, because in most cases a man can physically dominate his wife or any woman. That is the basest and most disgusting abuse of the relationship that he has been put in with his wife, that instead he is supposed to guard her from everything, including himself. And so if you consider what it means for a woman to submit to a man who has set himself apart to serve her in everything and to sacrifice for her in everything and to love her as Christ loved the church, what did Christ do for the church? Like, look at the life of Christ as it's supposed to be expressed by you in your relationship to a wife. Christ left his personal glory behind in order to serve the church. Instead of pursuing what he thought what would have been most glorious for him and most honorable for him, he took dishonor of becoming a human and living as a human and accepting weakness and poverty and suffering so that he could serve the church. When he was teaching, he was patient and kind and long-suffering. It's a good word, that old King James word. He was long-suffering with his disciples and even the crowds that followed him, and even the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who were irrational enemies of what he was trying to bring forward. He was patient and kind, and he did not lose his temper until something was happening that was inherently destructive to the church, right? That it was personally destructive, and then he lashed out to stop that which was causing self-harm, if you will. And then he died for the church. Can you do that? Because that's what you need to be to actually merit your wife's submission to your leadership. And you have to do it with Christ as your head. So you see Othniel here, he is highlighted only for this one thing, that he listened to his wife and he respected her enough to send her as the negotiator for the thing that she had suggested. And this too flies in the face of a lot of traditional masculinity. You have to read, like, the ideal wife, by the way, is presented in a chapter of Proverbs, Proverbs 31. You can read it, and it will give you a detailed account of the wife that is more precious than fine gems, right? That this woman who does these things is the most blessed treasure you will ever find. And the presentation there is of a woman who manages her household. She gives guidance to the servants, right? She's the ruler of the house, and she does all of the business of the house, and she's out in the market buying and selling, right? Selling, right? She's making things for sale. She's running a business. She's managing the orchard. She's the CEO of the operation here. And what is the man doing in that context? He's ruling the city with the other elders in the gate. So she has taken on the responsibility to run the household, and he has trusted her to do that so that he can go and lead in other things. That is not a picture of a man goes off to work and his wife cleans the house and stays barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, right? That's not what that is. It's a lot closer to Othniel, who was wise and understood that he had a choice wife in Axa, and that he respected her enough to negotiate on their behalf and to get what was best for their land that they were together responsible for. It wasn't his land, it was their land, right? And they were one flesh. And so what was good for one was good for the other. And there was a unity in that. So the manly man is one who equips his wife and then lets her do what is good. And he respects her and he listens to her counsel. And still, he leads and protects and guards her from harm. And he makes the decisions that need to be made to do what is best for them after listening to her counsel and after employing her strengths within their joint relationship. So this is not master and slave we're talking about. There is a relationship, which I know, and you probably don't for the most part, which actually is extremely close to this in every way, and it is the officer and NCO relationship in the armed forces of the world. Particularly, I'm thinking of the British, Canadian, and American tradition, because the continental traditions have different models for this. But in the regimental tradition and in the American tradition, what you have is that officers and their non-commissioned officer uh, team, they lead together. So, for example, a platoon commander has a warrant officer and, or a first sergeant in the American sense. Okay, so the platoon commander and the warrant officer together lead 30 troops. They also have sergeants that are underneath of them leading 10 troops each of the three of them, or however the platoon is structured. You might have 40 or more, but that's not the point. The point is that the platoon commander, usually a young lieutenant, he has been trained to make the tactical decisions and decide what the combat operation is going to be and to make the final decision on basically everything. The warrant officer is like, so the platoon commander looks up and he looks up at the direction coming from above and he looks out and he looks at the situation surrounding them and he makes decisions based on the guidance he has from above and based on the situation, and with his training he makes the decision about what they're going to do. But before he does that, right, he has his warrant officer who is looking out and down, and he's looking at the situation and he's looking at the troops, and he's going to advise that platoon commander on the state of the troops and also on his experience of situations like this, which he normally has a lot more of, that I think this is the right choice based on what I understand your direction from higher to be and what our limitations are with the troops that we got and the situation which I've confronted before. This is what I think you should do. Now, the platoon commander, generally, if he's smart, listens to his warrant officer. And even if he doesn't do exactly what is suggested, he's going to incorporate that into his decision. And he might modify his decision to allow for some of the considerations, or he best modify his decision to allow for some of the considerations. And the only time that you're ever going to see an officer totally disregarding, and not even disregarding, but totally going against his warrant officer's decision, or his warrant officer's advice, I should say, is when he knows the situation is other than what the warrant officer has dealt with or totally understands, right? Like, For example, the direction from higher, it's like you must do it exactly like this. Like, well, this is what we're doing. I know it's not maybe what we want to do, but we're going to do it, right? And you see that, right? So a company commander has a sergeant major. They're both experienced. They've both done a lot. Um, they have very different experiences. They combine those experiences into one cohesive vision as to how we're going to work together to accomplish what is best for the troops and what is best to serve the king, the commanding officer, right? And ultimately the actual queen who we swore an oath to together, right? Because we're Canadians. So, or the Constitution if you're an American, right? That's the king, if you will. That's what is supposed to be happening in a husband's relationship to his wife. He's supposed to be incorporating all of her strengths into joint decisions and then doing what is best for her to protect her and to guide her and to build her up and to do what is best for the family and to together serve the children and together to serve the community and to be powerful together as the two of you independently could never be, right? To do good things in service to the king and in service to the tribe, if you will. So that's what it looks like. So you have now three principles that we've got. A man needs a king. The only king is God that is worthy of the kind of service that is required of you as a man, because he never fails and his principles are always good. But have that principle in yourself first, and then be set apart for service to that king at whatever cost. And then respect your wife and integrate her into a joint work of service together, but lead her and guide her and guard her as your manliness requires of you. That's part of what it is to be a man. So I hope that this helps and gives some more flesh to this answer of what are the principles that we need to be following if we're going to incorporate a form of masculinity that is suitable to every environment, including the modern world. If you can incorporate these principles and the other ones we're going to find, you will not be stuck in a conundrum anymore about how do I deal with the hatred of toxic masculinity. Because this is not toxic. It's a kind of masculinity that even the most rabid feminist will have to respect because it isn't oppressive. It is a masculinity that builds up. It is a masculinity that empowers those around you. It is the masculinity of service at personal cost to those around you for the king. So let's keep going forward on this. It's been great to have you on the journey so far. I look forward to our next conversation because we're going to be looking at Ehud and Shamgar, who are the next two judges, and they are flawed or weaker judges. They're not unrighteous. They are just less powerful than Othniel. They don't have the means in themselves to accomplish great things. So we're going to look at how they do that in their context, and we're going to learn from them what it looks like to achieve great things without personal greatness and how a man can do that. By all means, if this is something that you have found useful, then pass it on to your friends and, continue to follow with us. So it's been great chatting, and I hope to see you again quite soon. Cheers.